Chris Bowen's target is to get to 82% renewable energy or renewable electricity by 2030. It looks an impossible task, the route he's taking, with wind and solar and a little bit of hydro. Here in Helsinki, well, I made a cup of tea this morning. I plugged the kettle in. You'd be delighted to know that it was 95% low carbon energy. How do they do it? How did they get beyond the target that we're aiming for in 2030 are going to miss? Well, nuclear, of course. Finland has invested heavily in nuclear. They opened a big new 2 gigawatt power station nuclear reactor last year at Oikalupu. I think I've got that pronunciation roughly close. And that's providing them with cheap electricity, reliable electricity. It is said to be one of the most efficient reactors in the world. It has a 95% capacity rate. That means it can run for 95% of the time, as opposed to wind and solar. Well, I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. 20%, 25%? Well, because cost is said to be the big issue, not here in Finland. I mean, the people don't seem too worried about their electricity bills here, which are quite low by European standards. But we're told, of course, by Chris Bowen that nuclear energy is too expensive, and he bases that analysis on some work by the CSIRO, the GenCost report. Well, Aidan Morrison and the team at the Centre for Independent Studies have done a very useful report pulling apart this GenCost report and finding that basically it doesn't stack up. Aidan joins me on the line now. Aidan, welcome to Reality Bites. The point about this is, Aidan, that the CSIRO, of course, we know are very good at science and technology. We love them for that, but it seems that they've gone sort of beyond their competence by getting into microeconomics and price theory. Is that what happened?
It's a really good question, Nick. I'm not sure whether that's the full extent of the story, that they're just unable to do economics. I would like to think that an organisation like that would really kind of, devote the resources required to acquire the proper economic skills that are required to do this type of thing. But to me, it seems that the flaws with the report are really quite, quite fundamental, and they seem not to have chosen just the necessary objective and proper benchmarks, like including all the costs and assuming that everyone will have to pay at the end of the day for all things we build in the system. And they've chosen to do a sort of a cost metric that they claim is fit for investors only. But we don't just pay for what investors have to pay for to build the generators, we have to pay for the rest of the system as well. So I'd like to think they could be competent and good conductors of economics as well as science. But in this particular case, the way that they have chosen not to incorporate the full costs and also chosen to use some very spurious data in assessing other costs, such as those of coal, in particular using the coal prices that were inflated by the spike of the Ukraine war and assuming that we essentially never resolve the coal prices from the Ukraine war. Things like that just seem to be choices that don't stack up with trying to do the best objective benchmark. I'm not sure whether it's competence. It seems like it's something else that's going on there.
And one of the things about renewable energy, they come up with the conclusion renewable is cheapest, but what they say is they discount any capital costs until 2030. So basically you put up a wind turbine development, that's going to cost you well over $1 billion in today's costs for 250, 300 gigawatts of megawatts, in power. And you've got to find that money from somewhere, but they're assuming that money comes for free, that capital cost is already a sunk cost by 2030. That's fundamentally poor economics, isn't it?
Yeah, look, the concept you described certainly seems like it's not particularly good economics. But I must caveat though that there's only certain capital costs they've chosen to exclude for that analysis of the value at 2030. It isn't the wind one specifically. It's got to do with the cost of the transmission and the storage as well that they put in the earlier stages. So they are very significant costs, however. So that's right. In the latest draft report for CSIRO, they have also tried to incorporate some of those costs if we were to kind of magically build the system right now in 2023. But they haven't then assumed that they assume that we can just pay a little bit of those systems off, and then at 2030 they essentially become free for the next investor, when that's certainly not how it works. We'll have to keep paying for those system costs ever after. And their get-out-of-jail-free card, so to speak, is that they're only considering what a new investor would face. But the obvious question that really we need to address when we're thinking about good policy is, what is the full cost stack that consumers face? What's the good investment that, in terms of what businesses and mums and dads, homes and families would face? And that is very much the full cost stack. So they've chosen a metric to try to excuse a method that doesn't really speak to what I think is the logical policy question at hand.
You have to do with the whole of system costs, don't you? I mean, okay, if I was to come and plug my electric heater into the base of a wind tower, you know, maybe it might be at that cost when the wind is blowing. But of course, it has to go down transmission lines. It has to go through, it has to be converted from DC power to AC power. All sorts of things have to happen along the way. And as we know, those transmission lines, we're talking now, I think, my estimate is close to $40 billion investment in transmission lines that are on the table right now. That's a lot of money. And you only need that for renewable energy, don't you, Aidan? You wouldn't need to build those extra transmission lines if it wasn't that your energy generation was so dispersed.
That's correct. It's something that we've taken for granted in the last sort of, historical era, that you can choose more or less where you build your power stations, and they tend to be clustered together, often around fuel sources or relatively close to the loads they serve. And you can also choose when they send power. So they tend to basically be able to, when one switch is on, another switch is off. So they match the load very closely. And in that system, in that regime, it's true that the transmission component is a relatively small part of the system. It's not the case with renewables that are dependent on the weather, however, because in order to try to get more diversity of weather, so there's some blowing at different times when the other is, you have to basically put your next installed amount of resource as far away as possible from the last one that you've built a lot of. But also that means you need to build new transmission to it. So that dispersed, highly correlated power, where you try to spread them out as much as possible to get diversity, it necessitates a completely different regime in terms of the amount of transmission required for the installed generation capacity. And it's because we have to move all the power around the country, also with storage around the clock and around the calendar. When you start moving power around as opposed to generating it near the place it's required at the time it's required, those complementary costs or those supporting infrastructure investments, they become really, really large indeed.
There's another point I think we need to make on this, Aidan, and that is that the GenCost report, the CSIRO's report, is modelling. It's their forecast of what they expect prices to be. It's not observation. Observation is what actual prices are. 2 points about that. One, every consumer would be aware that their electricity bill is going up, even though the amount of renewable energy in the system is increasing. I mean, if it was cheaper, you'd expect power prices to come down. And if you look at a country like Finland or France or Switzerland or Austria or not Austria, but well, Austria's got hydro, Slovakia, Slovenia, all these countries in Europe where I am now have nuclear power, and they are all much cheaper at a retail level than, say, Germany, which is eschewed nuclear power. So in reality, that speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Look, I think it does. It's very hard to try to find all the excuses now, or any better excuses for why power is more expensive in the places such as Germany, such as California, than it is in comparable other European states and comparable American states, for example. So I think that the writing is very much on the wall there. And yeah, I think that it's almost an inescapable reality now that this system cost induced to move power around the clock, country and calendar to make it available when and where you need it is a much more expensive total system cost. And so I think it's quite incredible what CSIRO have done to basically persuade us of the opposite, that the kind of baseload dispatchable system that we're used to has become more expensive. And there are other things that have done which I don't think are particularly defensible. Australians wouldn't know, reading the GenCost report, that the coal-fired power station they model their costs of coal on are not on a coal-fired power station that we currently have. It's an experimental design that's not actually in existence anywhere in the world. It's sort of potentially on the order books of an ultra high pressure design that's trying to eke out the very last level of efficiency. It's not the common models that we've built before. It's also not on a site that we already have, near existing rail lines, near existing ports. They assume new infrastructure in rail is required. 50 to 100 kilometres worth of new rail is required. So by modelling a kind of hypothetical, very much kind of gold-plated investment in greenfield coal, they're not really comparing it to the coal that we could expect to either keep in our grid or add to our grid. The reality is that the system that we had 10 or 20 years ago is very cheap, very low cost, and it's become more expensive in the last 10 or 15 years for a reason.
Just clarify that point, Aidan. You're telling me that when they model coal-fired power stations, they include the cost of a new rail line to take the coal to that plant. But when they model renewable energy, they do not include the cost, or they discount the cost of the transmission lines.
That's what happened in the latest finalised GenCost report. That's right, the one that was published last year. In the draft, they've gone a small step to trying to account for that error, not a full step and not a complete step in my opinion. But that's right, in the last finalised GenCost, that is the case. They've modelled hypothetical new rail for coal, but they haven't included the full cost of the transmission required for renewable energy.
So now to the big question as we get to the pointy end of the electoral cycle. We're coming to an election where nuclear will be a big issue. How confident, first of all, I'm not going to ask you to give me a cost for nuclear. It's just too difficult to do it with any accuracy because we're starting from scratch, etc., etc. But are you confident that in the medium to long term, nuclear will be cheapest for Australia, and if so, why?
I am confident in the medium to long term that nuclear will be a lot cheaper than a renewables-dominated system. I'm certainly confident of that. I'm actually not confident that it's definitely cheaper than coal. If we had no care for the carbon emissions and built the very cheapest coal plants at the sites near the mines we currently had and operated, coal is frightfully cheap, I have to admit that. But the renewable system that we're currently building, we have not even grappled seriously with the costs that are incorporated in that. The other document that we must mention is the Integrated System Plan, published by the Australian Energy Market Operator, and they have simply failed to include in that document as well the lion's share of the storage, which they assume will be borne by consumers purchasing their own home batteries and/or electric vehicles, and making them available at basically no net cost to the grid to support the grid operating as well. And there's a number of other areas there where I think the full cost has just not been comprehended with any seriousness at all. And we've recently published a report called The 6 Fundamental Flaws Underpinning the Energy Transition, highlighting these serious flaws in the documents that have given us this impression that renewables are cheapest overall. I find almost no basis for concluding that renewables will be cheaper than coal at all. And in nuclear, there's a great hope that in the future, when the technology is settled and we've paid off that initial capital cost, that the costs in the medium to long term will actually be very low. It is quite possible that in the long term, nuclear will compete even with coal. In the very short term, while we're installing it and facing those capital costs, initially, I think there's a good chance that it just won't be cheap as the purely coal-dominated system we've had for a number of years.
Well, they last a long time, don't they? I mean, the good news from Slovakia here is that an old Soviet-era reactor, nearly 60 years old, has been given an extension of life for another 20 years. It's been made safe, it's been improved. 80 years out of one of these. How long would you get out of a wind turbine or a solar panel, Aidan? You tell me.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you take CSIRO's numbers, they'd say you get about 25 or 30 years from a wind turbine or a solar panel. There are instances where sometimes the life tends to be shorter than that. But at the moment, the way the CSIRO GenCost report treats nuclear power is they assume it has the same 30-year lifespan in economic terms. And they assume basically that you have to write a loan that gets fully paid off in the first 30 years. So that later 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, that very long tail where you have an asset that is more or less fully paid off. It will need some upgrades and refurbishments to stay safe, but that's the period where nuclear power becomes extremely cheap. And all the models that we have at the moment, in particular the CSIRO's GenCosts, don't attempt to grapple with that future benefit you have, because they just assume that you have to more or less pay off the capital in 30 years and be ready to replace it again as new at that period of time. So it's that longer term investment that I think gives me the great hope that nuclear actually, if we choose to invest in it, will give us very, very low cost power in the long term future.
Now, I'd urge people to download your report and get into detail, because detail in this debate is always important. How can they find your report, Aidan?
Please go to the Centre for Independent Studies website, cis.org.au, and look for the research tab, look for the energy team, and you'll find the report very prominently available there.
Well, thank you for all the work you do leading the energy team. You're doing some great work. You've got more in the pipeline. Look forward to talking to you again, Aidan.
Thanks very much, Nick.